So the first stop on our journey through the evolution of drumming and the drum set is 1865. Now, why this particular date, 1865? Well, first of all, for those of you who know your history, 1865 was the year that the American Civil War ended. And that meant that African slaves and their descendants were free and could start to participate much more in American society and contribute more to American music. And as we see as we go through this whole series, African Americans have contributed a tremendous amount to the drum set and to the way that we play it. So what else was happening in 1865? Well, for the first time, drummers were starting to experiment with putting together more than one instrument. In other words, prior to this time, you had like marching band type of a scenario, or maybe classical music. And in those instances, a drummer would maybe play a bass drum, or they'd play a snare drum, or they'd play cymbals. Well, around this time period, you had drummers in theaters and stage shows and vaudeville type scenarios. So drummers started thinking, well, how can we have one guy do the job of many? And so this is a very interesting time period, and that's why we're beginning here. So what was the most popular kind of music that was happening in America in 1865? Well, as we said earlier, it was actually marching band music, because there was no jazz, there was no rock, there was no blues to speak of. This was before all that time. So you had marching bands, and the marching feel involved rudiments. It involved bass drum, kind of on 1 and 3, right? Boom, chick, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you had kind of this boom, chick thing going on. So the drummers that were taking this idea of playing more than one instrument at once were taking this concept of marching and started playing a bass drum and a snare drum together at the same time, but without a pedal. And they developed a really interesting technique called double drumming. You'll notice that the style that I used in playing that little demonstration had what we call a 2 feel, where the bass drum comes on beats 1 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, boom, chick, boom, chick, boom. So it's very downbeat heavy, and it's music that's designed to help large groups of soldiers march down a field from one end to the other. So it's very simple and straightforward. And as we move more towards the next segment we're going to get into, which is ragtime music, this kind of basic march idea starts to become syncopated. It starts to swing a little more, starts to dance a little more, and starts to move more towards dance music. The next stop on our journey through the evolution of the drum set is 1890. Now in 1890, there was a really interesting new kind of music that was coming up, that was kind of taking America by storm, and that music was called ragtime. Okay? And what was cool about ragtime, it had this kind of new feel to it, this sort of syncopated feel that came from African American piano players and banjo players and guitar players. It had this cool kind of this sort of thing we call syncopation. And that made people dance, made them go crazy. They loved to dance to it. So ragtime comes up and it becomes really popular in the 1890s. And by the turn of the century into the 20th century, it becomes probably the most popular kind of music in America. So how were drummers involved with ragtime? Well, interestingly, we talked about in the previous segment that, drummers were still really in a kind of a marching scenario, playing a lot of rudiments. And remember, the drum set at this time really isn't a drum set that we had today. We didn't have ride cymbals, we didn't have crash cymbals, we didn't have big tunable tom-toms, we didn't have a lot of fancy hardware. So drummers really had very little to work with to create the rhythms that they were going to create behind ragtime. But one of the fun things that started to happen was that drummers began to improvise more. So even though you hear the sound of rudiments, now drummers are kind of getting crazy with it, and they were utilizing them all over the place and improvising with them with this cool new sense of swing. Another interesting thing that was happening around 1890 was that tons and tons of immigrants were flowing into America from all different parts of the world, many different countries, many different regions. So you had Asians coming, you had people coming from Turkey and Greece, you had people coming from Europe. And all of these different people were bringing their ethnic instruments with them. They were bringing their drum making technology, their cymbal making technology. And as a result of that, drummers that were here in America who were doing this ragtime drumming and playing these different theater shows and these new kinds of music that were happening started to borrow these ethnic immigrant instruments and add them onto the very basic drum set, which we had said basically just consisted of marching instruments: bass drum, snare drum, and a cymbal. So they started putting all that together, and you get this cool new sound and feel called ragtime. Devices, these little contraptions that the immigrant groups were bringing with them to America and that drummers were borrowing, these started to become part of the very earliest drum sets. And of course, eventually, this term contraption was shortened down to traps. So literally, drummers during the last couple decades of the 1800s and the first few decades of the 1900s, right on up to about 1930, were called trap drummers. That's actually the way we didn't call it a drum set. We call it a trap set, and they were called trap drummers. The next stop in our journey through the evolution of the drum set and drum set playing is 1909. And this date is super important for all us drummers today because it was the date that the Ludwig family patented their famous bass drum pedal design. Now, we'll get to this pedal in a second, but certainly pedals had been around for a while. I've seen a photo from 1840 that showed a very crude operated foot device, but probably by 1870, in the 1870s, it was standard for drummers to use what was called an overhang pedal. And this was a real interesting device. It was also fairly primitive in that it actually attached to the top of the bass drum and went over the top, and then this spring thing came down and had this footboard, and you'd hit the footboard, and this little beater thing that was attached to the spring would whap, go in and hit the drum. Now, the overhang pedal design was really clunky. It was hard to get control over it. It was hard to play it quickly. And if you remember, we talked about double drumming. Most drummers in the 1870s actually preferred to do double drumming without any pedal at all as a way to play multiple drums rather than use one of these overhang pedals because they were so clumsy and hard to use. So this is a Ludwig pedal. This one is actually a little bit later. This one's from 1924, but it's very similar to the earliest pedals. And what always blows me away, we think, oh gosh, 1909, that's over 100 years ago. Obviously, what we have today is so much better than what those guys came up with back then. But in reality, we're still using the exact same pedal for the most part that they were using over 100 years ago. That's how durable and well thought out this design was. And as you could see, you basically have a spring, an adjustable spring. You have kind of a classic footboard, and that just does the same deal, pulls it down. You have a way to attach it to the hoop of your bass drum and tighten it down, and indeed you even have two different adjustments there, just like you do on most modern pedals. So this guy, has been around for a long time. Now, a couple of the things that, again, we think we're so advanced today. Well, these guys had a lot of real cool advancements going on as well. One of those is that early pedals often actually had a cymbal attached to the bass drum, and they would have a little thing coming out of here. This one has an attachment for it that you can see here, a little clanger. So when you press down on the footboard, this little clanger would come up and hit the cymbal that was attached to the batter head of your bass drum. So when the bass drum hit wham, it would get that clanging effect. The other thing you'll notice about this pedal that's a little different is this beater ball. Now, we've probably seen felt beaters before, but back in the day, they really had larger beaters. And again, this is because the bass drums of the time were much larger. They were often 26, 28, 30, even sometimes up to 40 inches in diameter. So they were huge. So the beaters really still resemble a marching band bass drum beater, which is a lot, tends to be a lot puffier and thicker. And where it's wearing away, you can see it's like a lambskin in here. So this is a lamb's wool beater. The other thing that's so cool about this pedal that we don't really think about today is that your average working drummer of the time didn't have a car. Not everybody had a car in those times. So they had to use public transportation to get to their gigs, which means they had to carry the entire drum set on their back because whatever you could fit on the streetcar was all you were allowed to carry. So this pedal is very, very cool because we can do this. Take that out, take this out, pull this out, and now your pedal's broken down, and you could just tuck it in your overcoat pocket, take it to work. So there you go, the bass drum pedal. Pretty cool. I'm holding in my hand something that probably most of you out there are very familiar with. These are a set of brushes, of course. And brushes are a real interesting story, and that's our next stop on our journey through the evolution of the drum set. The date is 1912. And 1912 is a year that, believe it or not, we could find patents for fly swatters that had been registered. Okay, now you're thinking fly swatters, what does that have to do with drumming? Well, interestingly, the need for brushes arose because drummers were having a lot of problems with always playing so loud and overshadowing the other instruments. You have to remember, in this early part of the 20th century, we didn't have big PA systems, we didn't have amplified guitars, didn't have mics to put on things, but drums were already the same sizes that we have today. In fact, the bass drums tended to be even bigger than they are today. So drummers could still make the same amount of noise, but they were going up against acoustic instruments. So drummers started looking around for stuff that was out there that they could use to play more quietly. And one of the things they came up with were these fly swatters. So you have to remember, this is the age before plastic. So when we think of a fly swatter today, we think about, plastic spatula looking thing, but fly swatters in this day actually were metal bristles like this. And they actually created some that were of the telescoping variety, so you'd preserve your little bristle. And a drummer picked this up one day and said, man, I could play, my little rudimental stuff that I've been doing, my ragtime drumming, my early jazz drumming, but use these fly swatters. And so thus begins brushes. And once they became more popular with drummers, well, then some of the companies that were manufacturing drum stuff said, well, hey, we'll actually start manufacturing these, and lo and behold, the name went from fly swatters to brushes. But for many, many years, drummers continued to refer to their brushes as fly swatters. When drummers first started using brushes back in the 1920s, they didn't use them the way we did today. They really used them as a quieter alternative to sticks. So, whereas you had your sort of rudimental sound, they would kind of imitate that with the brushes, kind of like this. Right? As we move into the 1920s and into the 1930s, they discovered that there was a lot of neat effects that you could get with the brushes. And part of it was about imitating dancers or imitating sandpaper, coming up with sort of different ways to use them. So then they started to add more effects where they would drag the brush across the head, for example. Right? So we get into that kind of a vibe. And of course, by the time we get into the 1930s, which we'll be talking about a couple more segments down the road, they really start integrating the brushes, and the brushes really take on, instead of just being an imitation of the sticks, they really take on their own vibe, and it really becomes an art form, brush playing. So our next stop